Hi and welcome. I'm Midnight Truth, and it's so nice to have you here tonight. Wherever you are right now, whether you're in bed, lie on the couch, or just looking for a quiet moment, I want you to know this time is for you. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the weight of the day start to fade. Let your mind settle. Let your body relax, and let yourself simply be. There's no rush, no pressure, just this calm, quiet moment. If you like, you can close your eyes and imagine yourself in a peaceful place. Maybe it's a cozy room with soft, warm lighting. Or maybe it's under a starry sky, with a gentle breeze brushing against you. Wherever you feel safe and calm, let yourself drift there. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Tonight's story is gentle and soothing, perfect to carry you into a deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. I never planned on moving into that house. It was one of those decisions made out of necessity rather than desire. After my divorce, I needed a fresh start, a place to gather my thoughts and rebuild my life from the ground up. The listing had appeared at just the right time, an old Victorian home on the edge of town, surprisingly cheap for its size. I should have questioned why. The house sat at the end of a long, narrow street, tucked between overgrown trees that swayed even when there was no wind. The paint on the siding was peeling, and the front porch sagged slightly in the middle, but it had character. At least, that's what I told myself as I signed the lease. Moving day was uneventful. The landlord, a wiry old man named Mr. Evans, handed me the keys with a peculiar look in his eye. "You'll find this place has history," he said, pausing just long enough for it to feel intentional. "What kind of history?" I asked, half joking. He waved a bony hand dismissively. Nothing worth worrying about. Just old stories. You know how people like to talk." I didn't press him further. I was too tired from the stress of the past few months to care about neighborhood gossip. Inside, the house smelled of dust and something faintly sweet, like rotting wood. The floors creaked under my every step, their voices whispering through the empty rooms. The previous tenants had left behind a few old pieces of furniture, including a heavy wooden chair in the corner of the living room. It looked antique, its dark with polish smoothed by years of use. For some reason, I felt an immediate dislike for it. I spent the first few days unpacking, settling into a routine. Mornings were spent drinking coffee by the large kitchen window, overlooking a backyard filled with brittle, dead grass. Evenings were quiet, aside from the occasional groan of the house settling. At night, though, things felt different. It started with small things. The sensation of being watched. The way shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. A door creaking open on its own, only to be found closed again an hour later. I told myself it was just my imagination, the side effects of living alone for the first time in years. Then I met Mrs. Doyle. She was my closest neighbor, living 2 houses down in a home nearly as old as mine. She was in her late 60s, with sharp blue eyes and a way of speaking that felt both warm and unsettling at the same time. "Not many stay long in that house," she told me one afternoon as I fetched my mail. I forced a chuckle. "Let me guess, more old stories?" She pursed her lips. "The last tenant left in the middle of the night. Didn't even take his things. Just ran out like something was chasing him." I swallowed. "Why?" She hesitated. "Said he heard things. Saw things that weren't there. He wasn't the first, either." A cold breeze stirred between us, carrying the scent of damp earth. "I don't scare easy," I said, more to myself than to her. She only smiled, but there was no humor in it. I suppose we'll find out soon enough. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the silence. It pressed against me like a weight, thick and suffocating. The old house groaned in protest against the wind, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the usual creaks and pops of an aging house, but deliberate, heavy footsteps. Slow, measured, moving across the hall outside my bedroom. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped just outside my door. I told myself it was nothing. The house settling. The wind shifting the floorboards. But deep down I knew better. And I had a feeling this was only the beginning. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had imagined the footsteps. It was too easy to explain them away. Old houses creaked, expanded. Wind carried sounds in strange ways. I repeated these things to myself over and over as I made my coffee, as I unpacked another box, as I swept the dust from the corners of the kitchen. But deep down, a seed of doubt had already been planted. The day passed uneventfully. I went into town for groceries, briefly stopping at a small cafe where I overheard two older men talking about the upcoming winter storm. I welcomed the normalcy, the chatter, the sound of steaming milk, the scent of fresh pastries. It was a reminder that life moved forward, that I wasn't trapped in some forgotten place swallowed by the past. When I returned home, the house was colder than before. I checked the thermostat, but it read the same as when I'd left. Still, the chill clung to me, burrowing into my bones. As I put the groceries away, I noticed something strange. The wooden chair in the living room, the one I had sworn I would never use, was facing a different direction. I stopped, staring at it. I tried to remember how it had been positioned that morning. Had I bumped into it? Had I moved it without thinking? The more I tried to reason it out, the less sense it made. The chair had been angled toward the fireplace. Now, it faced the hallway leading to my bedroom. I swallowed down a growing unease and forced a chuckle. All right, house. If you want to play games, go ahead. I muttered, grabbing the chair and turning it back. That was the first mistake. Hashtag. That night, I lay awake again listening. I had left a lamp on in the corner of the bedroom, its golden light stretching weakly against the walls. My thoughts circled back to Mrs. Doyle's warning, to the way she had said, asterisk, he wasn't the first. Asterisk, a gust of wind rattled the window, and I shut my eyes tightly, just the house settling. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard it, not footsteps this time, breathing, slow, deep breaths, just beyond my bedroom door. My body tensed, every muscle locking in place. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, something asterisk, was standing right outside my room, inhaling and exhaling with a steady rhythm. I turned my head slightly, my gaze locking onto the door. It was closed, but that didn't mean I was alone. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, silence. I stayed frozen, ears straining to catch any other sound. Nothing. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. I didn't sleep after that. I kept the lamp on until the sky turned gray with morning, my mind replaying the sound of that breathing over and over again. When I finally forced myself to step out of the bedroom, the house felt different, not just eerie, wrong. And when I passed by the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. The wooden chair was facing the hallway again, but this time it was closer, as if something had been sitting in it, watching. I stood there, staring at the chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. I wanted to believe I had moved it myself, that maybe in my exhaustion I had done it without thinking, but I knew better. A tight knot of dread coiled in my stomach as I approached it. The air around the chair felt wrong. It wasn't just that it had moved. It was the way it sat there, angled just slightly toward me, as if it had been watching, and turned its attention the moment I entered the room. My fingers hovered over the back of the chair. The wood was cold, much colder than it should have been. A sudden, sharp knock at the door made me jump. I spun around so fast, I nearly lost my balance. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing heavily. Another knock, more insistent this time. I practically stumbled to the door and yanked it open. Mrs. Doyle. She peered up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in my appearance. I must have looked awful, unshaven, dark circles under my eyes, a man who had barely slept. "Bad night?" she asked. I swallowed, glancing back at the chair before stepping onto the porch and shutting the door behind me. You could say that, I muttered. Mrs. Doyle pursed her lips. "It's starting, then." I exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over my face. "All right, enough with the cryptic warnings. What is it with this house? You said the last tenant ran out of here in the middle of the night. Why?" Her gaze flickered toward the window, as if she expected something to be watching from inside. Then she leaned in slightly. "There's something in that house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean, something?" She shook her head. "No one knows for sure. But I can tell you this. Everyone who's lived there hears the same things. The footsteps, the breathing. Some see things moving on their own. Furniture shifting, doors locking by themselves. Others have woken up to find something standing in their room." I felt my stomach drop. "They say the house used to belong to a man named Isaac Harrington," she continued. "Lived here alone for years. Was obsessed with strange things. The occult, rituals, things no decent person should be messing with. One night, neighbors heard screaming from inside. When they broke in, he was gone. Just vanished. Left behind only a journal full of strange symbols and ramblings about something coming through." A bitter taste filled my mouth, and no one thought to tell me this before I moved in. Mrs. Doyle sighed. You wouldn't have believed it. I wanted to argue, to tell her this was ridiculous, but I couldn't. Not after last night. "You should leave," she said, gripping my wrist. Her fingers were ice cold. "Before it gets worse." I looked back at the house, at the dark windows staring back at me like hollow eyes. I should leave. Every instinct screamed at me to listen to her, but something held me back. I wasn't ready to run. Not yet. Instead, I made a decision. I was going to find that journal, and I was going to find out exactly what Isaac Harrington had brought into this house. I spent the rest of the morning trying to shake off Mrs. Doyle's warning, but her words clung to me like a damp chill. There's something in that house. She had spoken with certainty, like someone who had already made up her mind about what was real and what wasn't. I wasn't there yet. I wanted proof. If Isaac Harrington had really left behind a journal, I needed to find it. I started my search in the attic. The pulled-down ladder groaned under my weight as I climbed up, dust swirling in the dim light. The attic smelled of mold and something faintly metallic. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, some half-collapsed, their contents spilling out in forgotten neglect. I worked my way through them slowly. Old clothes, rusted tools, books with cracked spines. Nothing unusual. Then, near the farthest corner, behind a heavy wooden chest, I found it, a small leather-bound book, its cover warped with age. My fingers tingled as I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, as if something inside it resisted being moved. Dust coated the surface, but faintly, beneath years of grime, I could make out an inscription burned into the leather. "Let the door remain closed." A shiver ran down my spine. I wiped the dust away and opened the journal. The first few pages were filled with neat, careful handwriting. Notes, dates, observations. At first, it seemed like the ramblings of a man obsessed with strange folklore, references to rituals, symbols, and something he called the threshold. But as I flipped further, the handwriting changed. The neat script became frantic. Letters scrawled with a trembling hand. Asterisk it speaks to me at night. In the walls, in the floors. The breathing. Always the breathing. Asterisk. My heart pounded as I turned the page. Asterisk, I thought I controlled it. I was wrong. It watches. It waits. Asterisk. Another page. The door is opening. I swallowed hard. The last entry was smeared. The ink warped by what looked like water stains. It is inside now. The attic suddenly felt too small. The air too thick. A soft creak sounded beneath me. I froze. It had come from downstairs. Another creak. Footsteps. Moving slowly through the house. My pulse slammed against my ribs as I strained to listen. The steps were steady, deliberate. Not random creaks from an old house settling. Someone or something was in the house with me. I clutched the journal and backed toward the attic hatch, barely breathing. The footsteps reached the bottom of the attic ladder. Then they stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I held my breath. Then, ever so slowly, creak, creak. The footsteps began climbing the ladder. Toward me. I didn't think. I grabbed the heaviest box near me and shoved it toward the hatch, slamming it shut. Dust rained down as I scrambled backward, my chest heaving. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, knock. A single, soft knock on the attic hatch. I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing myself not to make a sound. Another knock, and then a breath, long, slow, right beneath the wooden hatch. I clutched the journal, my fingers digging into the leather. I had my proof. Now I had to get out of this house. I stayed frozen in the attic, my back pressed against the farthest wall. The journal clutched so tightly in my hands that my fingers ached. The air was thick with dust, but beneath it, I could still hear that slow, deliberate breathing just beyond the attic hatch. It wasn't the shallow, unconscious breath of someone unaware they were being listened to. It was intentional, like it wanted me to hear it. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady my own breathing. If I panicked, I'd make noise. If I made noise, I'd give away my exact position. Another knock, softer this time, almost patient. I forced myself to move, crawling backward until my fingers brushed the heavy wooden chest I had shoved aside earlier. My mind was racing. I needed a way out, but there was only one entrance to the attic, and something was standing directly beneath it. Asterisk think, asterisk. I scanned the attic. There was a small, filthy window near the peak of the roof, too small to fit through, but maybe big enough to scream for help. Not that I thought anyone would come. I had one option. I had to get down there. Slowly, I reached for another box and slid it closer to the hatch. If whatever was out there decided to push its way in, I needed as many obstacles between us as possible. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and kicked the attic hatch open. It slammed downward with a heavy bang. The old ladder groaned as it swung down, revealing the darkness below. My heart pounded as I waited, expecting to see nothing. The hallway was empty. For a long moment, I just stood there, my ears straining. The silence felt unnatural, like the house was waiting to see what I would do next. I climbed down the ladder slowly, each step deliberate, my body tense with anticipation. I expected something to grab my ankle, something to reach out from the shadows, but nothing did. Once my feet touched the floor, I turned in a slow circle, gripping the journal like a weapon. The air in the hallway was cold, colder than it had been before. I didn't stop to question it. I moved quickly, heading straight for the front door. The house felt different now. The walls seemed taller, the hallway darker, the air heavier. But I kept going. I reached the door, unlocked it, and it wouldn't open. I twisted the knob harder. Nothing. My breathing turned shallow. I grabbed the handle with both hands and yanked, my shoulders burning with effort. Come on, come on. The door refused to budge. And then, a sound. Not footsteps. Not breathing. Whispering. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it was there. A low, insistent murmur that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. I pressed my back against the door, my chest heaving. The whispers grew louder. I couldn't make out words, but I could feel them pressing against my skin, crawling into my ears, seeping into my mind. And then, a single voice, right behind me. Asterisk, you shouldn't have read it. Asterisk, I spun around. No one was there. The hallway was empty, but the air felt different, like something had just moved, just shifted out of sight. My hands were shaking. I needed to leave. Now, if the front door wouldn't open, I'd go out the back. I turned and ran toward the kitchen, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whispering followed, slithering through the walls. Asterisk, you let it in. Asterisk, I reached the back door, grabbed the handle, twisted, unlocked. The door swung open so fast that I nearly lost my balance. Cold night air rushed in, sharp and biting. Without thinking, I bolted outside, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop running until I was standing in the middle of the overgrown backyard, my knees weak, my body shaking. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I knew it was still watching. I gripped the journal against my chest. I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell Isaac Harrington had let in, and if it was too late to stop it. I stood in the backyard, gulping down cold air, my pulse still hammering in my ears. The house loomed behind me, its dark windows like empty eyes. From the outside, it looked normal, still, quiet, but I knew better now. Something was inside, and worse, it knew I was aware of it. I tightened my grip on the journal, its cracked leather pressing into my palm. My mind was racing. I couldn't just stand out here all night, but the thought of going back inside made my stomach churn. I needed answers. I needed to understand what the hell was happening before it got worse. My first thought was Mrs. Doyle. She seemed to know more than she was letting on. Maybe she could tell me something useful, something that would help me make sense of this. But before I could move, a sound froze me in place. The front door creaked open. I whipped my head around, my breath catching in my throat. The door, the one that had been locked shut moments ago, now stood slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness yawned between it and the frame, as if the house had changed its mind about letting me leave. A deep, pulsing dread settled in my gut. It was toying with me. I took a slow step back, my instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this cursed house as possible. But my feet wouldn't move, because then, from that sliver of darkness, came the sound of something moving. Not footsteps, not breathing, something dragging, slow, heavy, like something pulling itself across the floor. I took another step back, my throat tightening. The night air was cold against my skin, but inside me, a deeper chill was growing, sinking into my bones. Then, a whisper, not from the house this time. From behind me, asterisk, why did you come here? Asterisk, I spun around, my heart slamming against my ribs. Mrs. Doyle stood at the edge of my yard, her silhouette barely visible in the dim glow of her porch light. Her face was pale. Her hands trembled at her sides. "You shouldn't be here," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard. "Mrs. Doyle, Get out." Her voice was sharp now, urgent. "Now, before it's too late." My mind reeled. "What is it?" I asked, stepping toward her. "What's in there?" Her lips parted, but then her eyes flicked past me, over my shoulder, back toward the house. And in an instant, all the color drained from her face. A cold, electric fear surged through me. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. Slowly, I turned my head and saw it, standing in the doorway, tall, motionless, a figure. Its shape was wrong, its body too long, its arms hanging at unnatural angles. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in the shadows, but I felt its gaze. Heavy, ancient, and then it took a step forward. The dragging sound followed, something shifting and scraping against the wooden floor. Mrs. Doyle screamed, "Run!" I didn't think. I just moved. I bolted past her, down the street, my lungs burning as I ran. My feet pounded against the pavement, but I could still hear it. The whispering, the dragging, following, chasing. I didn't stop running until I reached the town square, collapsing onto a bench, gasping for breath. When I finally turned back, the house was barely visible in the distance. The door was shut again, the windows dark, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew the truth now. The house wasn't just haunted. It was waiting, and I had just given it a reason to be patient. I sat on the cold metal bench, my breath ragged, my pulse hammering in my ears. The town square was empty, silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hum of a passing car. I had run blindly, without thinking, without stopping, until my legs refused to carry me any farther. I clutched the journal against my chest like a lifeline. My hands trembled as I traced the worn leather cover with my fingertips, my mind replaying what I had seen. Asterisk, that thing Asterisk, standing in the doorway, its arms hanging too low, its body shifting unnaturally. And the sound, that awful, dragging sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady my breathing. Mrs. Doyle had screamed at me to run. She had seen it too. Whatever was in that house, it was real, and it wanted me there. I forced myself to focus. The journal. I still had the journal. Maybe, just maybe, the answers were inside. I flipped it open, my fingers skimming over the brittle pages. The ink was faded, the handwriting messy, hurried. The words of William Mercer, the original owner of the house. I scanned the entries, searching for something, anything, that would explain what was happening. Then I found it. A passage, written in jagged, desperate strokes. Asterisk, the ritual is incomplete. I have made a mistake. The door opened, but I cannot close it. It watches me. It moves when I sleep. I hear in the walls. It wants something. It whispers to me in my dreams. I should never have called it. I should never have built this house on this land. It is older than me, older than everything. Asterisk, I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Another entry, days later. Asterisk, I tried to leave, but it knows. It won't let me go. I see the others before me, the ones it has taken. They are not dead, not alive. They are with it now, in the dark, in the walls. If anyone finds this, leave. Burn the house. Do not stay. It will take you too. Asterisk, a gust of wind blew through the square, rustling the pages. My fingers clenched around the journal. William Mercer had summoned something. He had brought something into that house, something that never left. And now it was watching me. A sharp click cut through the silence. A street lamp flickered. Then another, and another. One by one, the lights around the square began blinking out, plunging the space into darkness. I shot to my feet, my chest tightening. My breath came in short gasps as I scanned my surroundings. I was not alone. A shadow moved near the edge of the square. Long, twisted. Wrong. The dragging sound returned. Not from the house this time. From the street. Coming toward me. I took a shaky step backward, gripping the journal tighter. My instinct screamed at me to run. Then, a hand grabbed my arm. I yelped, jerking away, until I saw who it was. Mrs. Doyle. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "You have to leave," she hissed. "Now." I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "What is it? What did Mercer bring here?" She swallowed, her hands trembling. "He didn't just summon something," she said. "He fed it, and now it's hungry again." The dragging sound grew louder. I turned, and it was there, closer than before, a shape shifting the darkness, its body stretching unnaturally, its limbs too long, its head tilting in an inhuman way. The whispers returned, curling around me like cold fingers. Asterisk, stay. Asterisk. Mrs. Doyle yanked my arm. Run. This time, I didn't hesitate. We ran. We ran through the empty streets, our footsteps pounding against the pavement. The cold night air burned my lungs. But I didn't dare stop, not with that thing behind us. The dragging sound followed, slow but relentless. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It knew we couldn't escape. Mrs. Doyle's grip on my wrist was tight, almost painful, as she pulled me toward a narrow alleyway. We ducked inside, pressing ourselves against a cold brick wall. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure I could hear it. She put a finger to her lips. Silence. Then, a whisper. Asterisk, come back. Asterisk. I clamped a hand over my mouth. The voice was inside my head, soft, inviting. It wasn't just calling me. It was pulling me. The dragging sound stopped at the entrance of the alley. I didn't dare look. Mrs. Doyle squeezed my hand, shaking her head. I held my breath. The sound of something wet, shifting, stretching. Then nothing. Minutes passed. Or maybe just seconds. Time had lost all meaning. Finally, she nudged me. "It's gone," she whispered. I exhaled shakily, my legs trembling. "What the hell is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she peered around the corner, scanning the street. Only when she was sure we were alone did she turn to me. "It's been here for a long time," she said. "Since William Mercer built that house. He invited it in. And once it gets inside, it doesn't leave." My stomach twisted. "So it's what? A ghost? A demon?" Mrs. Doyle shook her head. "I don't think it was ever human." A shiver ran down my spine. "You said Mercer fed it." I said, "What do you mean?" She looked down. People disappeared. Tenants, drifters, even a few kids, all living in that house. No bodies. No evidence. Just gone. I swallowed hard. You need to leave town, she said urgently. It's marked you now. It won't stop. My mind raced. My apartment, my things, none of it mattered anymore. I don't have anywhere to go, I admitted. She hesitated. Then, with a sigh, she said, come with me. I'll explain everything. I didn't argue. Anything was better than being alone. We walked for what felt like forever, keeping to the shadows, avoiding streetlights. The town was eerily silent, as if it had drained all life from it. Finally, we reached a small, run-down house at the edge of town. Mrs. Doyle fumbled with the keys, glancing over her shoulder nervously. She pushed the door open. Get inside. Quickly. I stepped in, the scent of old wood and dust filling my nostrils. The place was cluttered, paper stacked on every surface, candles melted down to stubs, strange symbols carved into the walls. She locked the door behind us, bolting it shut. I turned to her. What aren't you telling me? Mrs. Doyle sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. I used to live there, she admitted, a long time ago. My breath caught. But I got out, she continued. Barely. And I never went back. I opened my mouth to speak, but then a creak, not from inside, from outside the door. My blood ran cold. Mrs. Doyle's eyes widened. The dragging sound had returned. It had followed us. The dragging sound scraped against the pavement outside, slow and deliberate. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath shallow. Mrs. Doyle reached for something on a nearby shelf, a rusted iron knife. She motioned for me to stay silent. The house was dead quiet. The only sound was a slow, rhythmic drag of whatever was waiting beyond the door. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then the doorknob twisted. I slapped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Mrs. Doyle gripped the knife tighter, her knuckles white. The knob rattled again, harder this time. The door groaned under the pressure. Then a whisper. Asterisk, you can't hide. Asterisk. The voice wasn't coming from the door. It was inside the room. My stomach dropped. My skin turned ice cold. I turned my head slowly. There, in the dark corner of the room, something shifted. A shape, barely visible, blending with the shadows. Mrs. Doyle saw it too. Her breath hitched. Then, in an instant, the thing lunged. I dove out of the way as the air turned freezing. The shape moved too fast, its limbs too long, too unnatural. Mrs. Doyle swung the iron knife, but it passed through empty air. The thing didn't move. It glitched. 1 second, it was near the door. The next, it was behind me. A hand, cold and skeletal, gripped my shoulder. I screamed. Mrs. Doyle shouted something, a word I didn't understand, and threw a handful of something into the air. A bitter, acrid smell filled the room, and for a split second, the thing jerked back. The weight on my shoulder disappeared. The room fell silent. Mrs. Doyle grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the door. We have to go. I didn't argue. She unbolted the door, and we ran into the night. The streets were empty, the town shrouded in an unnatural stillness. But the dragging sound was gone. We didn't stop running until we reached the outskirts of town. A gas station loomed ahead, its fluorescent lights flickering. Only then did Mrs. Doyle slow down, doubling over to catch her breath. I leaned against a lamppost, my body shaking. What the hell was that? She wiped sweat from her forehead. It's inside the house, and now it knows you. I swallowed hard. What does it want? Her expression darkened. To keep you there. Forever. I stared at her. She looked at the highway stretching beyond the gas station. You have to leave. Tonight. A lump formed in my throat. And you? I asked. She hesitated, then shook her head. I left once before. I should have never come back. I looked back toward the town. The house was out there, waiting. I could still feel it watching me. A thought crept into my mind. What if it didn't matter where I went? What if I could never really leave? A gust of cold wind swept through the station, making the lights flicker. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of something dragging across the pavement. 0, The gas station's fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting a sickly glow on the cracked pavement. I leaned against the counter, my hands still shaking. Mrs. Doyle stood beside me, her face pale and drawn. "You need to get as far away from here as possible," she said, her voice urgent but quiet. "The house has its hooks in you now. It won't let go easily." I swallowed, my throat dry. What if it doesn't matter? What if it follows me? She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something to slither out of the shadows. "Then you need to find a way to break the connection before it's too late." A ding from the counter startled me. The gas station attendant, a man in his late 50s with deep wrinkles and tired eyes, looked at us with mild curiosity. "Pump or snacks?" he asked. Mrs. Doyle reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, coffee, and a map. The attendant raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. As he rang up the order, I stole a glance outside. The night was unnervingly still. No passing cars, no wind, just silence. And then a flicker in the reflection of the station's glass doors. I turned too fast, my heart hammering. There was nothing there, but I knew better. Mrs. Doyle grabbed the coffee cup and the map, shoving them toward me. "We need to go." I didn't argue. We hurried back outside. The air was colder now, sharp against my skin. A distant street lamp flickered, barely cutting through the darkness. "We need to get to your car," she said. "My car." I let out a dry laugh. "I left the keys inside the house." She stopped dead in her tracks. For the first time, I saw true fear in her eyes. "You have to go back," she whispered. A deep chill settled in my bones. "No, no way. You saw what was in there." Her jaw tightened. "If we leave now, it will use that. Your car is a tether, a part of your life still trapped inside that house. If you don't break the tie, it'll never stop hunting you." I didn't move. The thought of stepping foot back inside the house made my stomach twist. The air, the darkness, the thing lurking in the shadows. I couldn't do it, but then I heard it. That familiar, horrible sound. A slow, deliberate dragging noise. It wasn't far. It was coming closer. I clenched my fists, my breath unsteady. "Fine," I muttered. "Let's end this." Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The house loomed ahead, more oppressive than ever. The windows were dark, empty sockets staring into the night. The front door stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I stepped onto the porch, the wood groaning beneath my weight. My entire body screamed at me to run. Mrs. Doyle stayed by the steps, gripping the iron knife. "I'll keep watch. Be fast." I swallowed and pushed the door open. The air inside was suffocating. Stale, heavy wrong. I forced myself forward, stepping over the broken glass and shattered furniture from our earlier escape. The shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting in ways they shouldn't. My keys, they were on the counter in the kitchen, just a few feet away. I took a slow, cautious step. The floor creaked. Something creaked back. I froze. A breath, not mine. It came from the hallway. The same hallway where I had first seen it. I reached for the keys, my fingers barely grazing the metal. The moment I grabbed them, the room shifted. The air turned frigid. A whisper slithered through the darkness. "Asterisk, you came back." Asterisk. A shadow moved in the corner of my vision. I spun around. The hallway was no longer empty. A shape stood at the far end, too tall, too thin. Its limbs were long and wrong, bending in unnatural ways. Its face, or what should have been face, was just a void, a deep black nothingness. It took a step forward. The floor beneath it sagged, as if it carried the weight of something immense. I couldn't move. Cold, invisible hands pressed against my chest, my arms, my throat. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The thing took another step, and suddenly, the room tilted. The walls stretched, the ceiling warped. The house itself was closing in. My vision blurred. My ears rang. Asterisk, stay. Asterisk. The word rumbled through my bones. No, I wouldn't. With every ounce of strength I had left, I yanked the keys from the counter and bolted for the door. The moment I moved, the house screamed. The walls shook violently. The lights exploded in a shower of sparks. The floor beneath me cracked like something massive was trying to break through. But I kept running. I burst onto the porch, gasping for air. Mrs. Doyle grabbed my arm. Go! We sprinted to the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands slick with sweat. Behind us, the house groaned like a wounded animal. I shoved the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life the moment the tires hit the pavement. The house let out a final, shuddering wail. Then, silence. I drove, past the gas station, past the empty streets, past the town limit. I didn't stop. Mrs. Doyle sat beside me, her hands clenched in her lap. Neither of us spoke. Only when the first hints of sunrise appeared on the horizon did I dare to look in the rear-view mirror. The town was gone, just empty road behind us. I exhaled, my body shaking from exhaustion. We made it, I whispered. Mrs. Doyle didn't respond right away. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward me. Her face was pale. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't. I frowned. What's wrong? She lifted a trembling hand and pointed at the back seat. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to look. I couldn't, but I did, and in the dim light of dawn, something shifted in the shadows. The dragging sound began again. The sound was faint at first, like fabric scraping against the seat. My knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. A trick of the wind, an overactive imagination. Anything but what I knew deep down was real. Mrs. Doyle's face remained frozen in horror, her fingers still pointing at the back seat. I didn't want to look again. I had no choice. Swallowing hard, I adjusted the rear-view mirror. At first, I saw nothing but darkness, the back seat shrouded in shadows. But then, a movement, a slow, deliberate shift. The shadows thickened, forming something solid. A shape, a figure, too tall for the car. Its limbs folded awkwardly, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. And that face, no, not a face, a void, a deep, consuming nothingness. The car swerved as I let out a strangled gasp. The tires skidded against the pavement, and Mrs. Doyle screamed, "Keep driving!" I forced my eyes back onto the road, my pulse pounding in my ears. My breath hitched. The car felt heavier, like something was pressing down on the frame, settling in, making itself at home. I gripped the wheel tighter, my vision blurring. "It's still here," I whispered. Mrs. Doyle clenched the iron blade in her lap, her voice trembling. "Don't stop. Don't acknowledge it. Just drive." I nodded, my hands clammy with sweat. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. The further we got from town, the lighter the air felt, but the thing in the back seat remained. I could feel it, watching, waiting. The dragging sound continued, slow, deliberate. I pressed the gas pedal harder, desperate to outrun whatever had latched onto us. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. "Mrs. Doyle," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" She hesitated. Then, through gritted teeth, she muttered, "We should have burned the house down." A cold wave of dread washed over me. She wasn't saying we should have left sooner. She was saying we had made a mistake. That leaving wasn't enough. I stole another glance in the mirror. The figure hadn't moved. Or maybe it had. Maybe it was just a little closer now. I swallowed the lump in my throat. If we stop the car, then it wins. Mrs. Doyle interrupted, her grip tightening on the knife. "We need to sever the connection. We need to break whatever tie it has to you." "Me?" Her eyes locked onto mine. "You lived there. You invited it in without realizing it." My stomach twisted. The memories came flooding back. The odd smells, the creaking floors, the whispers, the unseen thing watching me sleep. It had been waiting, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to acknowledge it. And now I had carried it with me. I clenched my jaw, forcing my breathing to steady. How do we stop it? Mrs. Doyle's gaze flickered to the iron knife. Iron disrupts it. Salt weakens it. But to break the bond completely. She trailed off. I braced myself. What? She hesitated before finally saying, "You have to return what it's missing." I blinked. Return what? She shook her head. Think, did you take anything from that house? Anything at all? I frowned, my mind racing. The diary. The one I had found in the hidden compartment. The one filled with frantic scribbles about rituals, doors that shouldn't be opened, and warnings left by a man who had clearly gone mad. My blood ran cold. "It's in my bag," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The journal." Mrs. Doyle's expression darkened. "That's it. That's the tether." I felt sick. But why? Because it belonged to him. She motioned toward the back seat without turning around. "You took a piece of the house." A piece of him, and now he's following it. A chill ran down my spine. "So what do we do?" Mrs. Doyle didn't hesitate this time. "We give it back." Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag. The road led us to an old bridge, its rusted metal beams looming against the night sky. Below it, a shallow river glistened in the moonlight. "Stop here," she instructed. I hesitated but obeyed, pulling over onto the gravel shoulder. The engine rumbled before settling into an eerie silence. The air felt heavy, thick, like we weren't alone. Mrs. Doyle turned to me, her voice firm. "Take the journal. Walk to the bridge. Toss it into the river." I nodded, but my body resisted. The thought of getting out of the car, of turning my back on whatever lurked in the back seat, sent ice through my veins. Still, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my bag, my fingers fumbling until they found the old, tattered journal. It felt wrong in my hands, the leather oddly warm, like something had been holding it before me. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The night was silent, unnaturally so. I took a shaky step toward the bridge, then another. The gravel crunched beneath my feet, each sound magnified in the suffocating quiet. I reached the edge, looking down at the slow-moving water. The journal felt heavier than before, almost as if something was resisting me. I swallowed, and then a whisper right next to my ear. Asterisk, don't. Asterisk. I spun around. Nothing, but I felt it. The air had changed. The dragging sound began again, closer this time. I gritted my teeth. "No," I muttered, gripping the journal tighter. "You don't control me." With every ounce of strength I had left, I hurled the book into the water. The moment it hit the surface, the air ripped apart. A guttural, inhuman scream echoed through the night, shaking the bridge beneath my feet. The shadows writhed, twisting violently before collapsing into nothingness. The weight in the air lifted, the unseen presence recoiling as if yanked away. Then, silence. I stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The night remained still. I turned back to the car. Mrs. Doyle stood beside it, watching me with cautious eyes. "Is it gone?" I whispered. She nodded. "For now." A shudder passed through me. "Let's get the hell out of here." We climbed back into the car, and this time, when I checked the rear view mirror, the back seat was empty. The drive back was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making you hyper-aware of every breath, every heartbeat. The weight in the car was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered, that even though the journal was gone, the thing that had followed me was still watching. Mrs. Doyle sat stiffly in the passenger seat, her knuckles pale against the iron knife in her lap. She hadn't let go of it. I didn't blame her. My hands were steady on the wheel, but inside, I was unraveling. I had done what she said. I had returned what it wanted. So why didn't I feel safe? The road stretched ahead, the headlights carving a thin path through the darkness. The town was still miles away, but the further we got from the bridge, the heavier my chest felt, like something was being pulled out of me, or something was pulling me back. I swallowed, tightening my grip. "Mrs. Doyle," I murmured, barely above a whisper, "are you sure it's over?" She exhaled slowly, rubbing the iron blade between her fingers. "I told you before, boy, things like this don't just end. They linger." I hated the way she said that, like she knew something I didn't, like I had missed something. A chill traced the back of my neck. Then, a tap, faint, almost imperceptible, coming from the window. I flicked my eyes toward the side mirror, my stomach twisting. There was nothing there. The highway was empty, stretching into the darkness like a blackened vein. Then, another tap. But this time, it wasn't from the window. It was from inside the car. I didn't breathe. The road in front of me blurred, my focus narrowing to the space just behind my seat. The back seat. Slowly, I adjusted the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I was just seeing shadows, a trick of the low light, the lingering fear in my mind manifesting as shapes in the dark. But then, a shift, the blackness coalesced, pulling together into something solid. A shape, no, a hand, reaching. I slammed on the brakes. The car screeched, tires howling against the asphalt. Mrs. Doyle gasped, bracing herself against the dashboard as we lurched forward. The car fishtailed, veering toward the shoulder before coming to a violent stop. Dust rose around us in thick, curling tendrils. Silence. Then a slow, deliberate creak, like someone shifting their weight, like something settling in. I didn't dare move. Mrs. Doyle's breath came in short, quick burst beside me. "Don't look," she whispered. Too late. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. And there, sitting in the back seat, a figure, thin, gaunt, stretched beyond human proportions, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its hollowed-out eyes boring into mine through the glass. No lips, no mouth, just a cavernous black void where its face should have been. A deep, suffocating cold pressed into my skin. Mrs. Doyle clutched the iron knife, her voice a thin thread of sound. "Drive." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The thing in the back seat twitched. Its fingers curled, elongating, stretching toward my shoulder. I gritted my teeth, forcing my hands back onto the wheel. Mrs. Doyle's voice cut through the haze. "Drive, damn it." I slammed my foot onto the gas. The car roared forward, tires spitting gravel as we tore down the highway. But it didn't move. The thing in the back seat, it just watched. I could feel its gaze, heavy and endless, pressing into the side of my skull. I kept my eyes forward, kept driving. Mile after mile, I refused to look again. Mrs. Doyle gripped the iron blade, whispering something under her breath. A prayer, a ward, a plea. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the weight lifted. The air in the car shifted. The pressure eased. I risked a glance at the mirror. Empty. I exhaled, my whole body trembling. Mrs. Doyle finally let go of the knife, her hands shaking. "It's not over," she muttered. I swallowed. "But it's gone, right?" She hesitated, and that hesitation was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. "It let us go," she said. A pause. "But it won't stop." I turned to her, my stomach twisting. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Doyle stared straight ahead, her face unreadable. "You gave it back what it wanted," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean it's done with you." A shiver ran through me. I turned my attention back to the road, my mind spinning. The town lights appeared in the distance, a small, flickering beacon of safety. But I knew better now. There was no safety, no escape, because when I rolled down my window, just for a second, the wind carried something with it. A whisper, a voice that no longer needed a body to be heard. Asterisk, "I'll be seeing you." Asterisk. And I knew in that moment, no matter how far I ran, no matter how long I pretended to be free, it was still waiting, watching, somewhere in the dark, waiting for me to come home.